Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Today, we are talking about the wisdom of anxiety. The title of this episode is also the title for the whole series, and it's been the heartbeat of each episode to help us understand what anxiety actually is, why we feel it, and how to take a more gentle and compassionate approach to the anxiety that we experience in our everyday lives. In this conversation, I want to talk specifically about the importance of connection when we feel anxious. Our bodies and brains were designed to thrive in relationships. When we're anxious about something, it might seem like a practical solution to our problem is the quickest route to a calmer state. But this is actually not the case. When we feel anxious, what we most deeply need is connection with God and others. We need someone with us who is regulated and attuned to our pain. Connection is essential in order to move through anxious moments, but it also can be incredibly challenging. Why? Because anxiety is an isolator. Let's unpack this. The experience of anxiety is often coupled with a felt sense that moving away from and hiding is our safest option. The reason for this is that by nature, anxiety tells us that we aren't capable, that we're powerless, that we're not enough, and that we don't have the resources to cope or overcome whatever we're facing. These messages immediately tap into our shame in a way that other emotions don't, and shame is deeply connected to our anxiety. That panicked voice inside of us can quickly turn from "there's something wrong that I'm not capable of changing" to a condemning voice of "there's something inherently wrong with me." Our shame can validate our anxiety and prevent us from reaching out or doing the thing that we are afraid to do. We feel that warm wash of embarrassment, so we want to withdraw and hide even more. And this vicious cycle continues, with our anxiety telling us that we aren't capable and our shame preventing us from reaching out for the connection and resources that we need. This cycle of isolation is powerful. And I know from experience, it can feel nearly impossible to break out of. Because here's the thing, anxiety doesn't result just in physical or social isolation. Physically isolating ourselves from others is definitely a component of anxiety. But the isolation that anxiety causes can manifest in several different ways, not just our proximity to people. It can cause emotional isolation as well. During high school, I went through a season of battling anxiety intensely. And when I wrote about this season in my book, Stop Saying I'm Fine, I called it my picture-perfect prison. Listen to how I describe myself in chapter 2. I write, consciously steeling myself with a synthetic smile, I would stay that way, hollow inside and happy outside for a long time. Empty pleasantries and a litany of I'm fines became my primary means of defense from any unwelcome exposure. I was careful to nod at all the appropriate times, laugh when I was supposed to, talk just enough so I wouldn't appear too quiet. Operating with the mechanical movements of a robot, I felt detached from my own body. Never had I been in such close proximity with others, and never had I felt more guarded and alone. Is it possible to ache with loneliness in one moment and then purposefully avoid eye contact, especially with a familiar face, in the next? During the season that I'm describing, I was with people all of the time, but I had mastered another kind of isolating. The art of hiding inside myself. I may have been physically present in every room that I was in, but I was emotionally absent. My anxiety was causing me to hide and withdraw in a way that was more subtle and maybe even more socially acceptable, but it was still isolation. In addition to social and emotional isolation, there is one more kind of isolation that anxiety can cause in us. Anxiety can often drive us to isolate or disconnect from ourselves. This kind of isolation is evident in my story as well. If we fast forward to my freshman year of college, I was learning different ways to cope with my anxiety, but I was still struggling a lot. I remember one morning I walked across campus to my therapist's office, sat down on her couch, and burst into tears. As we began to unpack why I felt so anxious, I remember her telling me, "Taylor, you're going to need to take some things off your schedule. Your pace of life right now is fueling your anxiety." I looked up at her and didn't miss a beat. "But you don't understand," I said. "If I slow down, my anxiety will catch up with me." Her eyes widened and she looked at me. I looked at her and I began to think about what I just said. I can't slow down or my anxiety will catch up with me. As my therapist and I began to unpack the meaning behind that statement that I just said so instinctually, I began to realize that I was isolating in yet another way. I was trying to isolate from myself. Specifically, I was withdrawing and trying to hide from the thoughts, feelings, and parts of myself that I didn't want to think about, acknowledge, or face. Self-critical thoughts often go hand in hand with anxiety. My own inner critic at the time, this berating voice I couldn't seem to turn off, was causing me to not be okay with me. As a coping mechanism, I was filling my days with people and activities and homework and classes and noise and early mornings and late nights, anything to distract me from being alone with myself. But rather than disconnecting me from my anxiety, my compulsive busyness was actually fueling it. When I reflect back on 18-year-old Taylor, I remember being so lonely, yet so scared for the depth of connection that I knew was only found in real community. My best friend and roommate in college, who I met my first day of freshman year, didn't know about my struggles with anxiety and didn't know that I was in recovery from an eating disorder until my sophomore year. A deep-seated fear of rejection and shame kept me from letting any relationship go beyond polite, casual conversation. To be honest, I was afraid that if they knew my story, they'd leave. So in the name of keeping others close, I kept my mouth closed. I lived on a campus of 10,000 students while feeling unknown and alone. I think this paradox is true for so many of us. When describing those of us who live in the digital age, Professor Sherry Turtle says that we are often alone together. We never move all the way into solitude or all the way into community. We are never really alone because even when we are by ourselves, we're on our phones. And when we're with others, we rarely let our relationships go beneath the surface. We're drawn to both, but also scared of both. When I think about my own story, that's where I got stuck. I wanted to heal, but I was scared to be alone with myself and scared to be truly known by others. And healing can't happen in the in-between. Briefly interrupting this episode to invite you to the Faith and Feelings Substack, a weekly Wednesday email and reader's favorite that allows us to continue the conversation we start here on the podcast. These emails include personalized resources, recommended links, and reflection questions designed to help you process each week's episode more deeply, both individually and in community. Click the link in this episode's show notes to become a paid subscriber for just $5 a month and begin investing in your own spiritual and emotional health today. God designed healing to happen in relationship with Him and with others. A passage of scripture that I've been reflecting on a lot recently is one of the first lines of the Bible, where the Spirit is described as hovering over the face of the waters. During the time that the creation account was written, bodies of water were considered one of the most chaotic and turbulent forces in nature. The sea was something to be feared because of how uncontrollable and unpredictable it was. Many religions tell ancient stories and myths about their gods going up against the sea with weapons and armies. But what I love about this passage is that the Spirit is described as simply hovering over this watery chaos. There was no fight. There was no hint of fear or force in the Spirit's stance. There was simply hovering. There was simply presence. When I think about my own anxiety and about the dysregulated state that so many of us live in today, I think that chaotic perfectly describes how we often feel on the inside. Oftentimes it feels like those waters are churning inside of me. But what's amazing to me is that God designed healing and change to happen in the same way that the Spirit hovered over those waters, with presence. In other words, I heal by allowing God and others to be present with me, and by opening myself up to being present to God. But that requires allowing Him and other people to come and see me in my anxiety and chaos, and to love me here. It requires me to open up to being loved in areas where I feel deeply unlovable. This takes courage, and because so many of us are used to living alone together, it takes a lot of practice. And here is where the wisdom of anxiety comes in. We've talked about how anxiety is like our body's alarm system, alerting us of deeper emotions inside of us that feel threatening. We've talked about how anxiety can often be linked back to childhood wounds and previous experiences of trauma. Anxiety is painfully uncomfortable, and of course, the goal is to move through our anxiety into a more regulated state. But there is an incredibly wise and kind part of anxiety. The wisdom of anxiety is that it alerts us to places inside of us that are hurting or aren't yet healed, and in doing so, invites us to be loved here. When we take that bold and risky step to invite others in to see and be with us in these unhealed and hurting areas of our hearts and lives, that's when our anxiety reduces, because our brains begin to learn that we aren't alone here. Anxiety is an isolator, but it can also be an inviter to connect more deeply with ourselves, others, and God. But if I'm completely honest, there's something that I've been learning about myself over the last several years. I'm not very good at letting myself be loved. In fact, the thought of letting others see and love the parts of myself that I don't like sounds really scary. I don't like when people see me in my anxiety. I fear people's rejection if they knew some parts of my story. If I were to use the analogy of a house, I'm perfectly okay with letting people onto my front porch. I'm even okay with letting people into the kitchen. I might even let a few trusted people go further into my house, maybe into the living room, maybe over time into a messy closet or two. But I keep the basement door locked tight. No one is allowed into the basement because that is where my shame is. That's where I keep all my secrets about the parts of me that I don't like and the parts of my story that I've promised myself I'd never tell. One of the hardest parts about healing is that we are wounded in relationship and we are healed in relationship. So much of our pain and trauma happened in the context of our closest relationships. So while we all have that innate longing for a deeper connection with others, we all have wounding experiences that cause us to simultaneously fear it. And our Western culture's tendency to live alone together is simply making this socially acceptable. But here's what I'm learning. The longer we keep our basement doors locked, the longer we will be unable to heal here. The basement will stay cold and musty and scary unless we let the light in. We need people that, like the Spirit, will be present with us in our chaos. We need people that will walk with us down the basement stairs and help us face those very places that we've been avoiding. Whether this is a therapist, mentor, or a trusted friend, we need people that will listen as we share our full stories and love us even more in the telling of it. This is when we truly begin to heal. To wrap up this episode, I want to share one more story that I hope gives just a little more context to what we've been talking about so far. As I've mentioned previously, due to the severity of my struggles with anxiety and an eating disorder during high school, I was admitted into a residential treatment facility the summer before my freshman year of college. During my 10-week stay, I received a lot of individual and group therapy. Towards the end of every client stay, we were invited by one of the group therapists to create a timeline of our lives and share it in one of the group therapy sessions. The only requirement was that our timeline include stories that were most formative in shaping who we are today. These stories could be both positive and negative. Other than that, we were given complete freedom to portray our timeline any way that we wanted, whether it was through painting or writing or singing, whatever best reflected our individual personalities. When the time came to start working on my timeline, I knew that I wanted to write it all out. I process best through writing, so I decided that I would read my timeline out loud in the next group therapy session. But I went back and forth about how I wanted to write it because I wanted to portray my timeline creatively. I remember the afternoon when I was sitting on the back porch steps of the treatment facility, laptop open, when the idea came to me. I wanted to write my timeline like I was inviting people into a tall building, with each floor representing a different age range and each room showcasing formative moments of my story. I wrote for hours without stopping. When I was finished writing, I titled the document, Building of My Heart. I was so nervous for our next group therapy session when I would read my timeline out loud. I'd put words to some painful, formative moments of my story that I'd never said out loud before. But that day, I mustered up enough courage to read it out loud. Every word. I cried as I read, sometimes so hard that I had to stop reading. But something happened in me that day, something deeply healing that marked my entire stay in treatment. As I read, the room was quiet, completely focused and attentive to every word I was reading, and deeply compassionate. I wasn't the only one that cried that day. As I read my timeline, I experienced tender presence in some metaphorical rooms that had held so much pain and shame. And in that moment, those places didn't seem to hold quite as much power anymore. Now, after treatment, I proceeded to lock up a lot of those rooms again and try to run away from them, as you heard about earlier in the episode. We need experiences like this over and over again for the rest of our lives. But as I was getting ready to record this podcast episode, I was actually able to go back and find my timeline. I reread it a few days ago, and I was struck by the way I described the outside of this building of my heart. I want to read just the first paragraph to you. This is what I wrote word for word when I was an 18-year-old in treatment. Imagine that my heart is a tall building. each floor representing a significant time of my life. Although each room is drastically different, the exterior of this building remains the same from the lowest to highest floor. Despite the damage of many rooms, despite the garbage and grime littering others, the outside is spotless, perfect, clean. As you drive up to this building, you pause and memorize your surroundings. Sculptured plants line the drive. You smile. You observe the fresh potted plants hanging from the first floor windows. You would never guess of the wreckage within. You pause and look up, trying to see the very top floor. The only difference from the first to last floors are the windows. The width and height of these windows equal my vulnerability with others. The first few floors are open. Large sliding glass doors and bright sunny windows are thrown open to let the fresh air in. But as your gaze travels up this building, you notice that the windows become progressively smaller. The very top windows are only the width of your hand, and they are completely clouded from the outside in. As you step into this towering building, you step into my heart. When I reread my timeline, I was struck by how I described the outside of my building. Spotless, perfect, and clean. That's how I portrayed myself on the outside, a high achiever and perfectionist. But that was far from true on the inside. And as an 18-year-old processing my story for the first time, I felt how much I didn't want people to see what was true on the inside of me. The windows just kept getting smaller as the rooms got scarier to invite people into. As we wrap up this episode, I want to invite you to send this podcast episode to a mentor or trusted friend. And if you're a Substack subscriber, I'll be sending out a more in-depth processing guide for you on Wednesday. And if you're listening to this episode after Wednesday and would like to receive this processing guide, you can still get it. Once you become a paid subscriber to my weekly Wednesday emails, you'll receive access to all of my previous emails and resources. You can find more information about how to subscribe in this episode's show notes. But regardless of whether or not you use this processing guide, I want to invite you to take a walk with a friend or meet for coffee after you've both listened to this episode and process these questions together. If you were to have a building of your heart, what rooms would be difficult for you to let people come into? Why do you think this is? What would your building look like from the outside? And when you think about God walking beside you into the rooms of your building, what do you imagine is the expression on his face? I pray this time is encouraging, and I can't wait to start a new podcast series together next week. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.